Welcome back. In our last lecture, we followed a criminal case from the moment of arrest through the preliminary hearing. We learned that criminal justice is a carefully structured process designed to protect both public safety and the constitutional rights of the accused. Today, we're going to take a step back and examine the court system itself. One question that many students may have when first studying criminal justice is, which court hears a particular case? The answer depends on the type of law that was allegedly violated and which court has the legal authority to hear the case. In this lecture, we'll examine the structure of the American judiciary by exploring the differences between state and federal courts, the purpose of trial and appellate courts, and the concept of jurisdiction. Understanding this structure is essential because every criminal or civil case must be filed in the correct court before it can move forward. Today's lecture lays the foundation for one of this week's learning outcomes. Compare and contrast civil and criminal hearings, including their purposes, case types, involved parties, burden of proof, and possible outcomes. Before we can compare different types of court proceedings, we first need to understand the structure of the court itself. As we move through today's lesson, pay attention to where different cases are heard and why certain courts have authority over some matters but others do not. By understanding the organization of the judiciary, you'll be better prepared to understand how criminal and civil cases move through the legal system. So why do we have two court systems? One of the defining features of the American legal system is that we have two separate court systems, the federal court system and the state court systems. Why is that? The answer lies in our system of federalism. The United States has a national government with powers granted by the U.S. Constitution, but each of the 50 states also has its own government with the authority to create and enforce its own laws. Because both levels of government have legal authority, each maintains its own court system. Federal courts interpret and apply federal law. State courts interpret and apply state law. Although these two systems sometimes interact, they generally operate independently while serving different purposes. Understanding this division is essential because determining which court hears a case begins with identifying which law has allegedly been violated. So state courts. Let's begin with state courts. State courts hear the overwhelming majority of cases filed in the United States. Most crimes that people commonly think about, such as burglary, robbery, assault, theft, domestic violence, DUI offenses, and homicide, are prosecuted under state law and therefore begin in state court. State courts also handle most civil matters, including divorce, child custody disputes, probate proceedings, landlord-tenant conflicts, contract disputes, and traffic violations. Each state organizes its court system somewhat differently, but most include trial courts, intermediate appellate courts, and a state Supreme Court. Because state courts handle such a large volume of cases, they are where most criminal justice professionals spend their careers. If you become a police officer, a prosecutor, public defender, probation officer, or even a judge, there's a good chance you'll spend much of your professional life working within a state court system. So then there's federal courts. And our federal courts serve a different purpose. Rather than hearing violations of state law, federal courts hear cases involving federal law. Examples include immigration offenses, federal drug trafficking, bank robbery, tax fraud, crimes committed on federal property, and violations of federal civil rights laws. Federal courts also hear cases involving constitutional questions, a dispute between states, and lawsuits involving the United States government. It's important to understand that not every serious crime becomes a federal case. For example, a murder committed within a city is usually prosecuted in state court. However, if the crime occurs on federal property or violates a federal statute, federal jurisdiction may exist. This distinction demonstrates why understanding jurisdiction is so important. The seriousness of the crime alone does not determine which court hears the case. Instead, the applicable law determines the proper court. Trial courts, where every case begins. Whether a case is heard in state court or federal court, it almost always begins in a trial court. Trial courts are where evidence is presented, witnesses testify, attorneys make arguments, and judges rule on legal issues. If a jury is involved, the jury evaluates the evidence and determines whether the prosecution or plaintiff has met the required burden of proof. Think of the trial court as a place where facts are established. This is where the court hears testimony, reviews physical evidence, considers expert opinions, and ultimately reaches a decision based on the evidence presented. Because trial courts determine facts, they play one of the most important roles in the entire judicial process. Appellate courts. After a trial is completed, a case may be appealed if there is an appealable issue. Many people mistakenly believe it is a second trial. It's not. So an appellate court generally does not hear new witnesses or consider new evidence. Instead, appellate judges review the record created during the trial to determine whether legal errors occurred. They ask questions such as, did the trial judge apply the law correctly? Were the defendant's constitutional rights protected? Did improper evidence influence the verdict? If significant legal errors occurred, the appellate court may reverse the conviction, order a new trial, or return the case to the lower court for additional proceedings. The appellate process helps ensure the law is applied consistently and fairly throughout the judicial system. At the top of the federal judiciary sits the U.S. Supreme Court. It is the highest court in the nation. Its primary responsibility is interpreting the Constitution and resolving important legal questions that affect the entire country. Contrary to what many people believe, the Supreme Court does not hear thousands of cases a year. Instead, it accepts only a small number of appeals involving significant constitutional issues or conflict among lower courts. When the Supreme Court issues a decision, that interpretation becomes binding on every lower federal court and influences courts throughout the United States. Because of this authority, Supreme Court decisions often shape criminal procedure, constitutional rights, and law enforcement practices for decades. Jurisdiction. One of the most important legal concepts we'll study throughout this course is jurisdiction. Jurisdiction simply means a court's legal authority to hear and decide a particular case. If a court lacks jurisdiction, it cannot legally resolve the dispute. For example, a robbery prosecuted under state law belongs in state court. A federal immigration offense belongs in federal court. A lawsuit involving a federal constitutional issue may also be heard in federal court. Jurisdiction ensures that cases are heard by the appropriate court and prevents one court from interfering with matters assigned to another. As future criminal justice professionals, understanding jurisdiction will help you determine where cases belong and why different courts have taken different responsibilities. Let's review today's lesson. The United States has two primary court systems, state courts and federal courts. Most criminal cases are prosecuted in state courts because they involve violations of state law. Federal courts hear cases involving federal statutes, constitutional issues, and matters assigned to the federal government. Every case begins in trial court, where evidence is presented and facts are determined. If legal errors are alleged, appellate courts review the decisions of trial courts rather than conducting new trials. Finally, jurisdiction determines whether a particular court has the legal authority to hear a case. Understanding the structure of the judiciary provides the foundation for understanding every court proceeding we'll examine throughout this course. Before moving on to the next lecture, I'd like you to think about this scenario. A group of individuals rob a federally insured bank and then flee across several state lines before being arrested. Should that case be prosecuted in state court, federal court, or both? What factors would determine which court has jurisdiction? As you continue throughout this course, you'll discover that answering questions like this requires a solid understanding of both the structure of the American court system and the laws that define each court's authority. In our next lecture, we'll build on today's discussion by comparing civil and criminal hearings. We'll examine how they differ in purpose, the parties involved, the burden of proof, and the possible outcomes. By understanding those differences, you'll gain an even deeper appreciation for how the American judicial system resolves a wide variety of legal disputes. I'll see you in the next lecture.